So first of all, thank you for inviting me to give this paper. I'm my first visit to Mexico City, virtually even, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you. So I'm going to cover a lot of ground, and I think I should begin with a trigger warning. I'm going to talk about the metaphysics as if it's a consistent and coherent work. And my experience is that there are a certain number of people who will be deeply offended to hear that. So trigger warning has been issued. I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to cover a lot of ground, and I want to make sure that it's clear how things fit together. I'm interested in proposing a different reading of the text and the metaphysics in general than has been around. I'm going to cover too much to actually probably convince you of anything, but at least if I can get it on the table, I'll be happy for that. Okay, so I'm going to begin with, yeah, I'm just going to sign into my other screen here. I'm going to begin, as you can see, with metaphysics beta, and there are two aporia here that I want to mention. One is an aporia about mathematicals, and the other one is an aporia about forms. On the numbering that I'm using, which is the second part of book beta, this is the first one is aporia 12, second one is aporia 13. So I've highlighted some of the areas of this. By the way, I copied this from the Perseus, so it's the Tredenek translation. It's not very good, but indolence and sloth prevented me from writing out a better translation or doing my own. In any case, the aporia about mathematicals proceeds like a typical aporia in book beta, and he gives arguments for both sides. What's the issue here? Whether numbers, bodies, planes, and points are substances or not. That's stated in the first line. And he has arguments in favor and against. So why would you think that they are substances? Because they define sensible things. The body is truly less of a substance than the plane than a line, the line than a point, for it's by these that the body is defined. It seems that they're possible without the body, and the body can exist without them. So the essential nature of a body is defined by the mathematical boundaries of it, and it includes interesting points and units. All right. On the other hand, the second paragraph here, every kind of shape is equally present in a solid, he says. So if Hermes is not in the stone, neither is the half cube in the cube as a determined shape. Hence, neither is the plane. For if any kind of plane were in it, so would that plane be which defines a half cube. The same argument applies to the line and the point. Hence, however true it may be that the body is substance, if planes, lines, and points are more truly substance than body, and these are not substances in any sense, and the question of what a being is and what the substance is, what is the substance of things truly baffles us. In other words, it looks like mathematicals should not be substances because they belong to bodies, and they exist in bodies and as delimitations of bodies, as divisions of bodies, as the line before the line that I've highlighted indicates. So we have a typical aporia from beta, and it's not entirely apparent from the way it's written here, but it's really an aporia about how it is that mathematicals could be unities. After all, they seem to be substances because they are one. They're one in the sense that they define the substance and they can exist without the bodies. On the other hand, they need the bodies and they exist as parts of the bodies, and therefore they're not really one. That's not apparent, but you'll see in a minute why I'm suggesting this interpretation. All right, let's go on here. Next aporia, also in beta. And this is about forms. In general, one might wonder why we should seek for other entities apart from sensible things and the intermediates for the forms which the Platonists assume. So the aporia is whether there are forms. And he poses it with this word apart. More about this in a second here. But the way he actually treats it is in terms of unity. If it's for some reason that the objects of mathematics, which while differing from things in our world in another respect, resemble them in being a plurality of objects similar in form, and it's really one in form. And then he goes on to talk about there are a bunch of twos in the world, and those twos are all alike in being twos. They're one in form, and there must be some other kind of unity, a one in number, that unifies all the twos. So it's a series of one over many arguments here. The forms seem to exist because we need forms. We need some sort of unity. On the other hand, this is the last thing here. If we assume that the form to exist, then the first principles are one in number, but not in kind. And we've already said what impossible consequences must follow. That's earlier in book beta. So my point is that even though the aporia is formulated as a question about whether forms exist apart, the way that it's actually discussed is in terms of unity, the unity of form and the unity of number of forms. And there's some reason to worry about forms being one in either way or both ways. Now, when we get to book Kappa, we have the same two aporia, but they're formulated in different ways. And notice the difference here. 12, if we posit lines or the things derived from them, I mean surfaces in the primary sense as principles, these at least are not separately existing substances, but sections and divisions, the former of surfaces and the latter of bodies. And further, there are limits of these same things. All of these things are integral part of something else. Not one of them exists separately. So what's new about this is the emphasis on the separate existence of mathematicals. They must exist separately to be substances. On the other hand, they really don't exist separately. The formula, it's almost the same. The formulation's different significantly. Number 13, aporia 13. I'm using the beta numbering here. No, I'm talking about the kappa. So the numbering's slightly different on most numberings in kappa, but it doesn't matter for our purposes here. Again, is there anything besides the concrete whole? I mean the matter and form in combination or not? If not, all things in the nature of matter are perishable. But if there is something, it must be the form or shape. So, what's the big deal? Why all things are perishable? Why is that a problem? Because standard argument, right? Knowledge is eternal. So the object of knowledge has to be eternal. If everything is perishable, then it will not be possible to have a knowledge of things. So what we need here, it seems, is something separate from the flux of things in order to have knowledge. If the something is separate from it, there can be something that's not perishable, and this can be known. On the other hand, it's hard to determine in what cases this is possible and in what's not. For in some cases, that of a house, the form clearly does not exist in separation. All right, I'm going way too fast here. to look at the arguments carefully, and they deserve to be looked at carefully. Let me first, I want to first pause for a second. Can everybody hear me? Is the volume loud enough here?
Yes.
Good, good.
This is
okay.
fine.
Good, okay, good. Okay, so there's a really striking difference here between the a priori as they're posed in book beta and as they're posed in book kappa. The beta a priori are posed as problems of unity. The kappa a priori are posed as problems of separation. Now, you might say, and you'd be right, that there isn't much difference here, because after all, if something is strictly one, it's going to be separate from everything else. It has to be. And if it really is separate, well, most likely it's going to be strictly one. So the two really go hand in hand, it seems. And a lot of times, Aristotle does use them similarly. But in this case, I'm going to suggest that there is a difference here. And the difference is okay, so what is the difference? We might have said, and this is the way, I'm not the first person to notice this, by the way. Yeager notices it, and he says, well, it's clear that book kappa was written talking about separation. It was written by somebody who was still influenced by Plato. And book beta is a later version of it. It's expanded later version of it. And it's more polished and so forth, more drawn out and so forth, which it is. So that's one way of interpreting it. But there's another, and I suggest a better way of understanding the difference. And we can see that if we go to the end, very end, the last words in book Eta 6. It's a pretty famous discussion, but I don't think that the import has been fully recognized. So here he says that he's interested in the unity of the composite in this chapter. And at the very end, he says, well, the form is an actuality, and the matter is a potential for that actuality. And actuality and potentiality are, in a way, one. That in a way is really important, but it's not strictly one, but in a way. Because the actuality, and this is what he really is talking about here in book Eta, the potentiality, the matter, are not just earth, air, fire, and water. It's proximate matter, the organs of the thing. So it's your, heart, kidneys, and so forth. And those organs are able to be organs, to do what they are, because they are capable of functioning. And if they're functioning, what we have is the actuality of the organism, of the ousia. Again, Aristotle famously says, if you cut off an arm, it's not an arm anymore because it doesn't function. To be an arm is to have the capacity to function. And so that's the matter. On the other hand, what's the form? The form is the various organs having the capacity to function together. You're still a human being when you're asleep. You have the capacity to function together, and your capacity is just your organs, in a way, the collection of your organs. So in a way, they're the same. That is what I think he means in this passage. But that's not my purpose here. It's the end of this passage that I want to focus on here. I've highlighted it. Thus, there's no cause other than whatever initiates the development from potentiality to actuality. Such things as have no matter are all, without qualification, essential unities. There's no other cause besides what? Form and matter, except for something else that would initiate, that would change the matter into a form. to have it develop into an actuality, to actualize the potential that is the matter. Now, let's think about this for a second here. The form and the matter belong to the individual ousia. Where is this other cause that would initiate the development from potentiality to actuality? And where is that cause that is, as he's suggesting here, that has no matter at all and is without qualification and essential unity? It's pretty clear that this is a reference to the first cause. And the first cause has to be separate from the composite. Again, form and matter, actuality, potentiality, account for the unity of the composite. What they don't account for is how it is that the potentiality gets actualized. For that, we need to posit something that is somehow strictly one that exists outside of the composite, that is a separate cause. So here's my suggestion. Up until this point in the metaphysics, the aporia in book beta are being answered by positing, arguing for an ousia that is intelligible in itself, whose principle of unity lies within it as its form, as its actuality. After this point, or more specifically, after the central books, Aristotle is interested not in the internal causes of an ousia, but in the external cause, the ultimate cause of the ousia, which of course is the unmoved mover, the separate cause. And the claim is that both causes are necessary. So at the risk of making the metaphysics actually coherent, I'm going to suggest in book beta, the aporia are in terms of unity. And they are answered, most of them, in the parts of the metaphysics up through the central books. And they culminate in this idea of a form that is a unity in multiple ways. It's one in formula, it's one in number, sort of. But it's not really adequate to account for the sense of ousia. It's necessary to posit a separate form. And consequently, when we get to book Kappa, Aristotle reformulates the aporia in terms of separation. A suggestion. Okay, finally, we're ready to start. And I'll start with the first chapter, first sentence. Since we're inquiring whether there is or is not some immutable, eternal substance besides or separate from sensible substances, right? That's the issue here. And if there is, what it is, some intervening things. And then he has three different problems here. So let's understand this. Book mu comes after lambda. He's already answered the question about whether there is a separate substance that is the cause of sensible substances. We might ask, why is he considering these other things, these other possibilities? And the answer, the obvious answer is he wants to refute them because other people have posed them as alternatives to his own unmoved movers. But there's another and better answer, but let's get to that in a second here. So what are the three questions? We must first consider the mathematical objects without imputing to them any other characteristic. For example, by asking whether they're really ideas or not, or whether they're principles and substances and so forth. That's number one. mathematicals by themselves. Number two, the ideas themselves, simply insofar as they're accepted, as far as the accepted procedure requires. Okay. And three, whether the substances and the first principles of existing things are numbers and ideas. So there are three problems, right? They're the problems of the mathematical objects, the problems of the forms, and the problem of whether or not these mathematical objects and forms are causes and substances. Okay. Now, after this, immediately after this, there's a passage that doesn't get really much attention, but I think it's really important here. If the objects of mathematics exist, they must be either insensible things, as some hold, or separate from them. There are some who also hold this view, but if they're neither the one nor the other, either they do not exist at all, or they exist in some other way. Thus, the point which we shall have to discuss is concerned not with their existence, but with the mode of their existence. So we need to ask whether the mathematicals are separate from sensibles or insensibles. That's what he's saying. And if it turns out that they're neither, as it does, we need to consider the mode of their existence. Now, let me go back to the question I raised a minute ago. Why is he talking about mathematicals and forms? The obvious answer, I said, is that they're alternatives as proposed as first principles instead of the unmoved movers. Okay. If that's the case, then what he really wants to do is refute them. They're not the principles. But that's not what he's saying here. It's not the only thing he wants to do. He wants to talk about the mode of their existence. So let me suggest his task in Book Mu is not just to show that mathematicals and forms can't be first principles. There really isn't much doubt about that. What his task is to show how mathematicals exist, and ultimately we'll see how forms exist. He doesn't reject them, he explains them. And this is important as a task for metaphysics, because metaphysics is concerned with the first principles, the highest causes of all things, but it's also, he says this in book Alpha, chapter 2, it's also architectonic and ruling in the sense that it needs to explain these other things as well. So ultimately, he needs to show not just that mathematicals are not first principles, but that the first principles that he has, the unmoved movers, can somehow ground mathematicals, and that mathematicals have some sort of existence. And I think this is what he's saying in this passage here. We need to be concerned with the mode of their existence. All right, so having said this, we move through to Mu2, which is an extended discussion of just this issue. Are the objects of mathematics in sensible things, or are they not in sensible things? Arguments against both. So let's assume that the objects of mathematics are in sensible things. Then what? Well, we would have, as he says under A, two solids can't occupy the same space. It's a strange idea, but suppose a mathematical solid. Suppose we have a sensible cube, and there's also within this sensible cube a mathematical cube. If the mathematical cube is a substance, an ousia, then we have two things, two UCI in the same place. Clearly, it's not going to work. On the other hand, let's suppose that the mathematical usia is separate. This is a long, there's a long argument here. Nor again can entities of this kind exist separately. It's a famous argument, and it doesn't seem to be a very good one. So what does he say? So let's go back to that cube here. If they're separate, we start with the cube, and then we separate out the mathematical cube from the cube. But that's not all we can do, because once we have the mathematical cube, we can separate the 6 planes. Once we have those 6 planes, they're bounded by lines. We can separate out the lines, and the lines are limited by points. We separate out the points, and then the points are numbered, and we get the numbers. So it looks like there's a kind of what he calls a kind of piling up or heaping up of mathematicals. And you might ask, well, big deal. You know, if the mathematicals exist separately, it doesn't really matter how many there are. It doesn't make any difference. It's not a very good argument. So what? There are a piling up of math. So what? They can be defined by multiple things. There are multiple mathematicals that are somehow defining the sensible. Okay, big deal. So what I want to suggest is that both arguments are making an assumption, and we can appreciate the assumption if we go forward to the next chapter where this aporia is resolved. So in the next chapter, we'll see in a second, the resolution of the aporia depends on understanding mathematicals as existing potentially in things. It's clear then that mathematicals are not potential in mu2. And the arguments are assuming that the mathematicals are not potential. If they're not potential, they've got to be actual. So first argument, we have an actual sensible cube, and we have an actual mathematical cube, and the one is in the other. We have two actualities in the same place. Clearly contradiction here. Cannot happen. What would we say here? Well, we'd like to say that the cube is in the mathematical cube is in the sensible cube potentially. That would make sense. And we would say it, and remember that aporia we read through a minute ago here from book Beta, just like the is in the stone. It's there potentially. But obviously that's not the assumption he's making here. And this is what's generating this side of the aporia. Okay, so let's suppose the mathematicals then are not in sensibles. I guess they could be separate from sensibles. And this, as I said, the piling up argument here doesn't look like it's a very good argument, but let's try to think of it again here. If it's the case that each mathematical entity is separate as an actuality, then when I pull out this cube from the sensible cube, the mathematical cube from the sensible cube, I separate them, then the mathematical cube is going to be, what am I going to say about it? I want to say the cube is defined by 6 planes, 6 squares, as it were. Except I can't say that because the 6 squares would have to be actualities. I have to separate them out from the mathematical cube as well. And then the mathematical cube, right, can't, the 6 planes can't be there either. What I'd want to say is that the 6 planes are potentially defined, potentially in the mathematical cube, the 6 squares, figures. But the assumption here is that there's no potential. Everything that exists is actual. So I have the sensible cube, I take out the mathematical cube, and now I want to understand the mathematical cube. How am I going to define it, understand it? 6 planes, except I've got to separate them from them. Now I can't. How do I get back from the 6 planes to the mathematical cube? What I need is some sort of spatiality, and that's exactly what I don't have. So this this argument here, that the piling up argument that looks so bad, once we recognize that Aristotle is making this assumption, and the assumption is that mathematical objects exist as actualities, then this argument becomes actually pretty compelling here. We can't have a mathematical object if its constituents are also going to be actual. Because if its constituents are actual, then we have one mathematical contained in another mathematical again. We've got to separate them out until we get down to back to the numbers, and we can't go the other way. So, all right. So what do we have here? Mathematicals can't be in sensibles, and they can't be separate from sensibles, assuming that mathematicals are actualities. Well, we already have, as it were, a solution to our problem. The mathematicals have to exist as potentialities. And if we go to mu3, this is exactly what he says here, except, well, he says a little bit more. So I've quoted it here, this passage. Thus, if we regard the objects independently of their attributes and investigate any aspect of them as so regarded, we shall not be guilty of any error on this account, any more than when we draw a figure on the ground and say that a line is a foot long when it's not, because the error is not in the premises. The best way to conduct an investigation in every case is to take that which does not exist in separation and consider it separately. Again, separation is the issue here. We take the mathematical object, it doesn't exist separately. We just argued that it can't exist separately. But nonetheless, we can treat it as if it existed separately, which is, when continuing to read here, which is just what the arithmetician or geometrician does. For man, qua man is one sensible thing. And the arithmetician assumes man to be one indivisible thing, and then considers whether there's any attribute of man qua indivisible. And the geometrician considers man neither qua man nor qua indivisible, but qua something solid. For clearly the attributes which would have belonged to man, even if man were somehow not indivisible, can belong to man irrespectively of his humanity or indivisibility. And hence, this reason, the geometricians are right in what they maintain. For this reason, the geometricians are right in what they maintain and treat of what really exists. That is, the objects of geometry really exist. For things can exist in 2 ways, either in complete reality, that's to say actuality, as alethea, or as matter, hulikos. And it's clear that hulikos means potentially. Okay, so what do we have here? We made a mistake thinking that the mathematicals exist as actualities. That leads to aporia, but they do exist as in the matter or potentially, and they exist in a real way potentially. So let's go back and think about this again. We looked at the aporia stated in beta. Just as Hermes is in the stone, so too the mathematicals are in the sensible object. They're there potentially, and they're really there because the potential is a real thing. Now, this is strange, to say the least here. I want to just say something about how odd this is. Let's start with a sensible cube, if you will. And the first thing we should notice is that the sensible cube is not a real cube. It's not what a mathematician is going to talk about. But nonetheless, because it's a solid object within the sensible cube, there really is a mathematical cube. Now the dimensions in mathematics never really make any difference. They're always relative to anything. So it doesn't matter if the sensible cube is 1 foot long or if it's 1 inch long. The same mathematical cube is going to be within this. If we can just, shave off the sides here, we can locate it. And likewise, a mathematical sphere will be there as well, because it's a solid object and all solid objects will be contained within it. But that's not all. Those sides of the sphere, the circles that are circles of the great circles of this solid circle, they'll also be there. And it's pretty clear all of the mathematical objects will be within any one sensible thing. Why are we not running into the same problem we had before, a plurality of usei? Because they're not usei. And in fact, they don't have any actual existence. They're there potentially. And the claim is that this is what how mathematicals exist. This is their mode of existence within sensible things potentially. The mathematicians don't deal with sensible things. Obviously, they deal with the shapes. That's also Aristotle's point. They don't have to. It's metaphysics that knows how mathematicals can exist as potentials within the matter of a sensible thing. Mathematicians can focus on the natures of these things and their attributes. Now, there's another little problem here I'll mention before going on. There are no, in Gamma of the metaphysics, Aristotle argues there are no attributes of attributes. So if it's the case that we take a mathematical cube and we separate it or treat it as if it's separate, we'd like to define it. We'd like to talk about its properties. But the properties would be attributes, and the mathematicals, belonging as they do to the categorical genus of quantity, would be attributes of an ousia. We'd be dealing with attributes of attributes. And this can't be. So I suggest that Aristotle was actually alive to the problem and solving it in what I just read here. Again, this is the passage from mu3. Clearly, the attributes which would have belonged to man, even if man were somehow not indivisible, can belong to man irrespectively of his humanity or his indivisibility. So these are the attributes of the cubes or the solids or whatever shape that we're dealing with here are also, they're really attributes that belong to the sensible ousia that we're talking about, but we don't have to treat them that way. Now, this sounds perhaps a little like what Jonathan Lear understands here, that this qua locution here in mu3 is a kind of predicate filter. And it seems to me that this is not a very helpful way to look at this passage. What's really important here is not the predicates. What's really important is that the mathematician takes one quantity or some number of quantities and treats them as separate, and he's treating them as if they were subjects. What's important is not the predicate, it's the subject. So There are lots of other problems here, and I'll just mention one. And if I have time, which I hope I will, I'll come back to it. The problem is this makes a lot of sense when we talk about geometric figures. It's pretty clear from what we read here and from chapter 2 that it applies to numbers, but it's really difficult to apply it to numbers. It's much more intuitive to talk about the number of people in a room than to talk about a number belonging to one person. So this is something we can come back to, but this is not without its issues. All right, so I'm somewhat limited here. I want to move along to talk about forms. This is the account of mathematicals so far. How do forms get accounted for? So in mu 4 and 5, we get the first pass at this treatment, and it is again, it's parallel to mu 2. There's an aporia, and the aporia concerns whether the form exists separately or not separately. And remember, mu 4 and 5 are often read with with Alpha 9, where Aristotle also discusses the forms proposed by the Platonists. But it's here in mu 4 that Aristotle mentions that it wasn't Socrates who separated the forms. It was Plato, or at least other people after Socrates. Separation is important here in a way that it's not important, not the focus in book Alpha. So, okay, so why would anybody think that there are separate forms? Famous discussion of Heraclitus here. The world is in flux. The object of knowledge. Knowledge is eternal. The object of knowledge has to be eternal. It can't be eternal if it's something that's in flux. It's got to be separate. And therefore, the Platonists separated the forms. On the other hand, it's pretty difficult to talk about separate forms because they don't seem to be helpful in understanding the sensible things that we want to use them to understand here. And this is another famous argument that I just copied. It's as if a man wanted to count a number of things, if he were disposed that he couldn't do so if there are just a few, and yet were to try to count them when he added to them. So he's a kind of, this is the doubling argument here. So on the one hand, we have a good reason to think that knowledge is, for knowledge, it's necessary to separate the forms. On the other hand, there's a good argument that separating the form doesn't provide us with any kind of knowledge. It's like doubling, and in fact, it's even worse, because what we would know is the separate form, and what we wouldn't know is the sensible things that we're trying to know. Because why? Well, the separate forms are going to be eternal. On the other hand, the sensibles are in flux and they're unknowable. So our attempt to come to some sort of knowledge of sensible things through forms undermines itself. And the forms then shouldn't be understood as separate. Okay, so we are, there is a long discussion. This is the aporia, okay? And there are two forms. One of them is kind of the ordinary forms, and then he's another one he calls a more technical version. I'm going to skip, well, okay, I'll skip over that mostly, but I'll just mention here. I'm skipping over mu 6 through most of 9 here. And this is where he talks famously about the academy and the various versions of forms, form numbers, and numbers that the academy proposes. And I have an account of why he talks about them here, and actually why it fits in with the larger picture of what we get in book mu. But for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over it and just go on and talk about the very end of book mu. Now, at the end of 9, he begins what I take to be problem number 3 that's spelled out in mu 1, whether the forms are causes and usii, substances. And he says here at the end, I've highlighted it, they not only treat the ideas as universal substances, but also as separable, really separate and particular. Separate and particular. So let me try to phrase it in this way. There's been a lot of discussion of the forms all through the metaphysics. It's pretty clear that there's something seriously wrong with this doctrine. On the other hand, the forms are, as he says here, they're both individual, they're both separate, and particular or individual, and they're universal. So what I want to suggest is that at the end of book mu, it's the form as universal that's really on the table here. And the form as universal has a kind of legitimacy to it that the Platonic form does not have in general. Because after all, Aristotle recognized there are universals. They have some, but what are universals? And this is the question that he's answering in chapter 10, or more particularly, how do these universals exist? So I'll just take a look at it quickly here. Okay, he says, if we don't suppose substances to be separate, that is in the way in which particular things are said to be separate, we'll do away with substance in the sense in which we want to maintain it. But if we suppose that substances should be separate, how are we going to regard their elements and principles? So if they are particular and not universal, there will be as many of them as there are elements. And this is, I want to suggest here that this is exactly parallel to the argument, the piling up argument that we saw in mu 2. The elements, just as the elements of mathematicals have to be separate if the mathematicals are separate, assuming that the mathematicals are separate as actualities, then their elements will have to be separate as actualities. So too with the forms or the universals. If they have elements and the universals are separate, for the same reason, the elements of the universals will have to be separate. And if they're separate, they're going to be individuals. And if they're individuals, then what? Well, knowledges of the universal, they can't be known. So ironically, the reason to introduce the universals is to get some possibility of knowledge. But if those universals are separate, we undermine the possibility of knowing the universals. On the other hand, if the first principles are universals, this is the next paragraph here, either the substances composed of them will be universal substance because the universal is not a substance, drawing on the arguments in Zeta 13 through 16. Universals are not substances. Okay, and the element or first principle is prior to that of which it is an element or principle. So we have problems whether we suppose the universals to be separate or not separate, either way. And we are near the end of book mu and near the end of this talk. This is the last paragraph of book mu, the doctrine that all knowledge is of the universal. and hence that the principles of existing things, but also separating substances, presents the greatest difficulty of all that we've discussed. There is, however, a sense in which this statement is true, although there's another in which it's not true. Knowledge, like the verb to know, has two senses, of which one is potential and the other is actual. This ought to sound familiar. The potentiality, being as matter, universal and indefinite, has a universal and indefinite object, but the actuality is definite and has a definite object because it is particular and deals with the particular. And he goes on to talk about how this is actually, how it's actually going to work here, which is to say, when you see a color, well, what you're actually seeing is blue or orange or whatever. But the color is also universally color. Now, where does the universal exist? Potentially within the object. It is exactly parallel to what we saw in U3 as a solution to the problem of mathematicals. There's an actual and there's a potential. The universal has a real existence. And where does it exist? It exists in the individual. It exists in the individual as a potential. It exists in the matter of the individual in exactly a parallel way to the way in which the mathematical exists in the individual. There's a lot of stuff going on, but if you think about it, it makes a certain amount of sense. The mathematical object is in the matter of the thing. It's potentially there. All of the mathematical objects are potentially there. If we think about the universal, how does it exist? In the individual. It's potentially there. And what does that allow? What's the point of having a universal that's just potential? Universal is the object of knowledge. It's possible to know that we're all human beings because within each of us is not only our form, our actuality that makes us what we are, but that universality that we share in common with other people. And I think that I've covered a lot of ground, but it's really striking how the account of mathematicals and the account of universals, which is again the count of forms, are exactly parallel to each other. In each case, he's concerned to show not just that Platonic forms can't be first principles, that Platonic mathematicals can't be first principles, mathematical forms can't be first principles. He's concerned to show how they do exist and how it is that they belong to sensible things. Now, you might say, and this will be the last point that I'll make, look, there's something really wrong with this because sensible things are not eternal, and yet universals and mathematicals exist eternally. So how is it possible for there to be knowledge of mathematicals that is universal, that is eternal, if it's the case that the mathematicals exist in sensible things that are not eternal? And the answer, in a word, is, I guess it's fitting that I end my talk here. You'll be happy to know I am ending it. The answer is, it's the unmoved movers. What is it that guarantees the persistence of sensible things? Not one sensible thing or another sensible thing, but sensible things in general. Something that is eternal and an eternal cause of a potential being actualized. And that's what the unmoved mover does. It's the unmoved mover ultimately that makes it possible for us to have knowledge of sensible things, because the unmoved mover guarantees their eternity in a sense. So when I know the properties of a mathematical cube, the cube has an existence in some sensible thing. The sensible thing isn't eternal, but the mathematical cube is eternal because it exists in any sensible thing of the same sort. And that is an answer to the problem of how it is that the unmoved movers, the first principles of all things, ground mathematicals and universals. So I've probably exceeded my time and certainly exceeded your patience. Thank you for listening to this. And I didn't get to talk about everything that I wanted to, but I think we've covered enough ground. At least the view that I'm proposing should be clear, even if it would take quite a bit more to make it convincing. Okay, so thank you.
Good work. Thanks a lot for this very stimulating talk. And then we are going to move now to Q&A session. So please raise your hand if you have a question. Okay, Ricardo.
Yeah, thank you very much, Edward, for this paper. Very illuminating analysis of very difficult texts. And I have 3 questions. And so let me ask the first 2 questions, and then the third if there is time. So the first question is a very general one about the metaphysics as a whole. And well, the question is this, is that what's the place of book Zeta, according, if you have any views about this, the place of book Zeta within the project stated in book Alpha, the project of finding the ultimate principles of things, no? So, and the answer to that question is given by Aristotle apparently in book Lambda, where he says that the unmoved mover, no, is ultimately the principle of all things. So I mean, given that project and that answer to the question about principles given in Lambda, given that, what's the place of the project of Metaphysics Zeta? Because the project of Metaphysics Zeta, I mean, in very roughly, is stated by Aristotle at the beginning of Zeta, and he says there that the question or at least one of the main questions he will address in that book, Zeta, is to determine what is substance, ousia, and more precisely, what is the substance of something. No? So why is that question relevant to the project of the metaphysics outlined in book Alpha and answered or achieved or carried out in book Lambda? No, I mean, this is a difficulty in the interpretation of the metaphysics, which I don't expect you to have a definite answer, but maybe you do have an answer to this question, and so that's my first question. And my second question is much more specific. My second question is about one of the passages you cited at the beginning of your talk, which is the Aporia 13 at the beginning of chapter 6 in book Beta. No? it's this Platonic argument which Aristotle doesn't seem to reject as bad. He doesn't accept it either. But it's I have some difficulty in interpreting the argument. I assume that the key idea in the argument is that the key idea comes in the following sentence. I'm reading the translation by Reeve, right? So in Reeve's translation, thus, if there aren't beyond perceptibles and the objects of mathematics, other things such as some people say the forms are, then there will not be substance that is one in number but in form, nor will the starting points of beings be so and so many in number but in form. So one assumption in this argument is that perceptibles are not one in number but just in form. So I mean, but why? I mean, why would a Platonist say that? Because if anything, perceptibles are not one in form, because you can say, for example, following the Heracliteans, that perceptible objects are indeterminate. So you cannot say whether they belong or not to a certain class. And in that sense, they are not one in form. But why aren't they one in number? So that's one puzzle. And the other puzzle is this, is that forms, Platonic forms, do not seem to be one in number either. If by one in number you mean what you mean is that it is the only thing of its kind, no? And no, I mean that's one way of interpreting the idea that perceptibles are not one in number. They are not one in number because there are many perceptible things of each kind. But forms too seem to have this problem, no? Because forms are not one in number in that sense because there are many forms. And so how do you interpret this argument, and in particular the claim that perceptibles are not one in number? So that's my second question. My third question, should I leave it for later, Edgar?
I'm having the time of my life, and I'm happy to stay here all day. So I'm I leave it up.
Thanks,
Please,
Edgar.
Please ask your question.
Edgar?
I leave it up to the chair if
So Edgar?
Yes, please ask the question.
So my third question, Edward, is about the exegesis of another passage, important passage that you cite towards the end of your paper, well, towards the middle of the paper, which is this passage from Me 1, where Aristotle says that numbers, or mathematicals in general, are either imperceptibles or separate from perceptibles. And if neither, I mean, neither in nor separate, then either they do not exist at all, or they do exist, but in some third way. And from that, Aristotle concludes that, therefore, we will not be asking whether mathematicals exist, but only how they exist. Now, the conclusion doesn't seem to follow from the premises, because in the premises, Aristotle mentions first the possibility that mathematicals do not exist. So if you are going to address this question, you will be asking whether they exist or not. So this seems to contradict what he says at the end, on the one hand. And on the other hand, I mean, what is this third way? I mean, if they do not exist in perceptibles nor separate from perceptibles, I mean, is there any other way in which they could exist, according to Aristotle? So I mean, my concern here regarding this passage refers to the conclusion, no? Therefore, we will not ask whether they exist, but just how they exist. I mean, that doesn't seem to follow from the diagnosis he just gave of the existence of mathematicals. So, I mean, these are very difficult passages and very enigmatic even. So I don't know if you have any views about this, Edward.
So first of all, thank you very much. These are really great questions, fundamental to the metaphysics. And I want to answer them, but my answers are going to be so quick, it will seem as if I'm not taking them seriously, which is not the case. I think that they're, like I said, they're really fundamental. So the first question is about the status of book Zeta, and Zeta is part of the central books, and it really goes with Eta. Zeta and Eta form really one book. It got divided into two, and it follows the structure that's set out in Zeta 3. He has 4 possibilities, and he considers each of the 4. And one of the 4 breaks down to 3. And that third possibility, the composite, is considered in book Eta, along with the matter. But anyway, your question is very important, because a lot of people have thought that there is a kind of an irreconcilable divide between the account of sensibles in book Zeta and the unmoved mover in book Lambda. Now, if we really are interested in the first principle, we wasting so much time with the sensibles. So my answer is, again, it's much too quick for the question, because it deserves much more attention. But the answers that I want to propose is that there are actually 2 issues throughout the metaphysics, and one of them is the internal first principles, and the other one is the external first principles. So Zeta and the central books in general are concerned with the internal first principle. I have a sensible ousia. What is it that makes it an ousia? And in terms of Zeta, in chapter 2, he lists, okay, we want to talk about what is, in chapter 1, what is being, and what is being is what is ousia. And in Zeta 2, here are a bunch of ousiae that everybody agrees. The animals and the plants and the parts of animals, and then there's some other ones that people are disputing about, but here they are, Zeta 3. Now, what is it that makes each ousia, each sensible ousia, or non-sensible ousia, what is it that makes it an ousia? This is the question that he raises at the beginning of Zeta. It is the question that he treats throughout the central books. And the answer that he comes up with is form. And form is not just form, it's also essence, tauta enenai, and it's also energeia or entelechia. They're identical. And there's a kind of convergence in the discussion here. It's really important to understand that, to understand the first principle, because this internal first principle is really essential for understanding the external first principle. Each ousia is what it is because of something that resides within it, namely its form. On the other hand, what is it that allows the ousia to sustain itself? Because each ousia is it's finite, it's limited, it comes to be and passes away. If we're going to have knowledge, and if we're going to find the first principle of everything, we've got to find something that's eternal, and that is an eternal cause of sensible ousiae. And they have to have this aspect of eternity to them. That's the role of the external principle. And this external principle comes in lambda. And it's of course, it's the unmoved movers. So instead of saying that they two are at odds with each other, as most of the tradition, most of the recent, the scholarship over the last 100 years, certainly since Jaeger, I'm going to say they're complementary, and we need both of them to get a complete picture. And book Zeta is not an alternative to the physics. The central books are not an alternative to physics. The physics is another approach. It's a way of understanding motion. In the central books, we're interested in understanding the being of these sensible things, and ultimately, that being requires a separate cause. So that's your first question. As far as the second question about Aporia 13, again, a really fundamental question, and it is connected, I think, with your first question. So why you're interested in why the perceptibles are not one in number. I think that's the way you formulated it. So usually, in Zeta 13, I quoted it there, and you read it in the Reeves translation, much better translation than the Tredenek translation that I had lazily used. But usually it's thought something like this. There are a bunch of there's a 2 in one pair and a 2 in another pair and another pair, and all these 2s have something in common. Their form is in common, and yet they're all 2s, so there must be something. There must be some nature that they all share as 2s, and that's the form of 2, and that is perhaps the form number. But in any case, there is some sort of unity that's required in order to understand that the 2s are all 2s. That unity is, it seems, it's going to be both 1 in form and 1 in number. And that goes. What's that?
What do you mean by 1 in number?
Right. So this is a question that you did raise this question. Yeah, right. So look, if there's one pair and one sensible pair, another sensible pair, and another sensible pair, I've got a bunch of 2s, and I can say that they all share the same form. So they're 1 in form, or Aristotle likes to say 1 in formula sometimes. But also they're all 2s. So each pair, and each 2, which is what allows us to grasp the pair as a pair, each 2 is an instance of the 2. So the form itself needs to be 1 in number. And I don't think you suggested maybe there's only one form. That might be the case. That's more controversial, but I don't think that's the case here. He just means that the 2 itself is going to be 1 numerically. There's only one 2, just as only one justice. The form of justice, yes. And there's the form of the 2. Okay. And yeah, right. So okay. So and what does this have to do with book Zeta? In book Zeta, when he talks about the form, he argues that the form is 1 in formula and it's 1 in number. And that looks like it would be universal. In particular, it doesn't say it's a universal. It's not a universal, but nonetheless, it is 1 in formula. And that is his alternative account of what we see in Aporia 13. It's again, Aporia 13 is a unity problem, and he solves the problem in the central books by explaining the unity that the form has. And that's why when the problem comes up again in book Kappa, now he has to explain what kind of reality, what kind of separation it has. So this is exactly your third problem, right? So what kind of separation does the mathematical entity have? Or what kind of separation does the form have? And I quoted a passage in the first chapter of Mu. The mathematicals are not insensibles, apparently, and they're not separate. So we have a what looks to be a contradiction. Either they're insensibles or they're not insensibles, right? So what do we do if it turns out that they're both wrong? Well, first of all, we need to realize that we're not dealing with a contradiction, but a contrariety. And they can both be wrong, and there's some other alternative. And the other alternative is that they exist in, but potentially in. So the problem with the mathematicals being in, problem with universals or forms being in things or being separate from things, that's a problem if we think of mathematicals or universals as actualities. And Aristotle proposes to resolve the problem, to undermine the contradiction, by saying mathematicals are not actualities, they're potentialities. It's like, again, from beta, aporia 12 in beta, it is like the Hermes that's in the stone. Is it there? Well, it's there potentially. Is it really there? Yes, it's really there potentially, because a skilled sculptor could chisel around the stone and it would be evident that it's there. And likewise, with the sensible thing, you having studied mathematics, are able to see the sensible block and to see that within this block there is a sphere. It exists potentially, but it really is there. And it's there enough that we can talk about its perfect dimensions, its perfect circular sphericity, really. And we can do mathematics on such an object. And I think that's whatever we want to say about it, it limits mathematicals to sensible things. That's the drawback, and a lot of people have objected to that. On the other hand, they're there potentially. There are lots of other things that are there potentially, and whatever we find in mathematics, we have to find in a sensible thing. And I think that's it. I think that's an incredibly interesting solution to this problem. And it's a solution that's exactly parallel to his solution for the forms. He doesn't dismiss the Platonic forms, as most people seem to think. What he says is, yeah, some of the things they said about them were wrong, but the Platonic forms are universals, and they too exist potentially in sensible things.
Okay, thanks, Edward.
Yeah, thank you for the questions.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Ricardo. And now, Lucas and Johnny, please.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Right.
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Well, my question is actually a small question, clarification about the way you take key expression in Me3, which is that qua operator. So you mentioned something about Jonathan Lear's position about this sentence being a kind of filter for predicates or something like that. And then you said that you take them kind of differently, as if the most important concern were not the predicate but the subject. And first of all, I wonder if this is exactly an accurate description of what you have said, because at some point it was bad internet connection here. But then a specific question is whether you don't think that this is not exactly a question of putting away on the subject or putting away on the predicate, because I don't see the thing in this way, because it's always a relation between three things that is involved when Aristotle uses this expression qua. So we have one given thing, for instance, the sensible substance, in this case, a man or physical cube or something like that. Then we have the mathematical predicate, and we have after the qua, after the he in Greek, third item, which is, I think this is what Jonathan Lear might have said, that it is a kind of filter that informs us the perspective on which the subject is being taken as subject for that specific predicate that is in question in the sentence. I think it's probably you agree with that. So I wonder if it's not more useful for your purpose to say that the use of the qua expression in the argument of me3 is more focused on the, not on the nature of the predicative relation itself, but on the, let's say, status or ontological status of the, not the subject exactly, but of that third term that is put after the qua. Because we have these three items. Is, let's just take a physical object like a human being. So we have a human being, then we have a mathematical predicate which is at stake, then we have the human being as something. But then it turns out that this item that comes after the qua expression is the subject of the mathematical geometrical proposition, but it's not the most important or the most fundamental underlying subject from the metaphysical point of view, because it's in a way it exists potentially, as the chapter is explaining, but it's somehow said of underlying physical substance, etc., etc. This is part of what you meant, but I just want to be sure that I'm getting exactly the essential point of your proposal here.
Okay, thank you for the question. So there really there's two dimensions to mathematics, and I think is what you're saying. On the one hand, there's the metaphysical dimension, and the other one is the mathematical dimension. So from a metaphysical point of view, which is what he's really concerned with in Mu3 and book Mu in general, the mathematical is a quantity. It exists in a particular categorical genus, and it belongs always to an ousia. So when we consider mathematicals, what we're really considering is ousiai in a certain way, the quay way, and that's what you're talking about. And that's really important to know, that mathematicals belong to ousiai. But it's also important to understand them from the perspective of the mathematician. So what does the mathematician do? He treats these quantities as if they were separate. And to treat them as if they were separate is to treat them as if they were ousiai, because it's the ousiai that are separate. So from the mathematical point of view, the mathematician doesn't know about, he's not talking about Socrates or human beings that are, or sensible substances. He's talking about the mathematical objects as if they were ousiai. And in order, if you think about this in terms of the posterior analytics, you've got to have every science has its subject genus, and its subject genus is going to be some sort of an ousia, or at least in this case, something that we can take to be an ousia. And the science is interested in demonstrating attributes that belong essentially to the instances of this genus. So from the point of view of mathematics, we've got plane figures or triangles, and we want to figure out all of the attributes that belong to them in respect of their being triangles. So we've got to take the triangle as if it were separate, as if it were an ousia, and we've got to take that as having some attributes. And it's really important to understand that the quay is not the metaphysical perspective, like you're suggesting, and I think Lear is suggesting. It's really the mathematical perspective. It's the mathematician who treats the triangles as if they were separate and is interested in demonstrating their attributes. Now, how is it possible to do that? Well, it's possible because each categorical genus is distinct from each other one. So I don't have to worry about qualities, the musicality of Socrates when I talk about his matter and his being a solid object. And that's actually pretty interesting. And that allows mathematicians to do what they do and not have to worry about other things here. So I don't know if we're really disagreeing or not. I think that I'm just going to try to say this again here. The issue is really the two ways of looking at the mathematical object, a metaphysical perspective and a mathematical perspective. Both are right, but it's the mathematical perspective that takes the mathematical object qua separate and treats the attributes that belong to it. Now, the mathematician is not interested in the subject. It's the metaphysician who is. And what the metaphysician has to understand is that by treating the mathematical object as if it were separate, we don't run into any problems. We can treat, and that this mathematical object, even though it isn't separate, has a reality to it as a potential object. And that's what he means with this hulikos here. It has a material existence, but that's still a real existence. So my objection to Lear is, it sounds really good. I admit that, but it's just not helpful. It doesn't help us understand the passage very well. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, it's more clear now what you think. So if I can add a follow-up. So you think that this treatment Aristotle offers to mathematical objects, exactly in these terms you have just described, could be extended to forms of natural objects when we're dealing with physical sciences in the following way. We are not exactly, so my point is to put the cards on the table is this. So Aristotle is saying that when the geometer is doing geometry, he or she must look for what is primarily explanatory, and this kind of priority, explanatory priority, not necessarily will track the kind of ontological priority that the geometrical object does not have, because the physical body has this metaphysical priority. So would you say that Aristotle has kind of extended this to forms in general, to the point that the solution given in mid-10 is somehow related to this kind of solution? So in the sense that when take some natural discipline, so the natural sciences focus on a given subject, which happens to be, for instance, horses or cattle, etc., etc. But he is not exactly interested in all of it. He's just selecting a given perspective, pretty much in the same way as he's selecting perspective on the physical objects that results in the geometrical figures. And then in this way, what Aristotle might be suggesting, the whole of the argument in the book, the Me book, is that, well, this sort of things that the scientist does, namely to identify the principles that explain things in a given way, etc., not exactly track that same sort of ontological priority that give us substances, this priority of substance over attributes in general, in a very general point of view. Sorry for the long question, but it's
right. Okay. So if you're talking about the natural sciences, yes, there's a similarity here, but that's closer to the account. That's not so surprising, because the natural sciences deal with ousiai, So, and how do they deal with them? They deal with the genera of UCI. Where you should look for parallels is in the areas that are not, the things that are not UCI that we still know. So what are those? Music is a good one. In the Deisensu, Aristotle has an account of color. Now, color is a quality. How can there be a science of color, of a quality, if the subject of every science is an ousia? And the answer is the same thing we get in U3. We treat it as if it were a substance. We separate it, treat it as if it's separate, and it exists separate, at least in our minds. And that's fine. We don't run into any problems when we do that. So I think that Mu3 and Mu10 are different. Mu3 is talking about how you can have a science that treats something that's not a substance, and in particular mathematics, which is really important because it seems to be so intimately connected with first principles. But the account applies to any science of a non-ousia. In chapter 10, we're really talking about universals, which have their own status. And this is a classic problem in medieval philosophy. What's the status of the universal? We get an answer, and it's at the very least, it's a very interesting answer.
Okay, thanks a lot, Lucas. Now, Gonzalo, please make your question. We don't. We cannot hear you, Gonzalo.
Your microphone is off.
Yes, Gonzalo.
You're muted, actually.
Yes. Is he?
Yes, Gonzalo. Yeah. No?
Okay.
Let me see. And maybe we can come back to Gonzalo's question so later. So maybe we move to Taylor's question, please.
Oh, Edward, thank you for your talk. I thought that was really interesting and helpful. I'm interested in what it means to exist separately. And I know this is a difficult question, and it might be beyond the scope of your current project, but it seems to be crucial. Like I take it that we particular individuals are the things that exist separately, but I'm having a hard time understanding what we exist separately from. We always have properties. Universals are always in us potentially. And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you think Aristotle thinks he means when he's talking about separate existence.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, and it's not very easy to answer it. I mean, in one sense, you're separate from me, so and you're separate from other people as well. So it looks like the sensible ousia is going to be the best candidate for something that's separate. On the other hand, in the beginning of book Epsilon, he says, these sensible ousia, they're not separate. Why is that? Because we always exist with matter, and we can't really be separate from matter. So the best candidates turn out to be things that have no matter at all. So what you get is a lot of separate in formula, or separate haplos, absolutely. And you're separate in one way, or as we just saw talking about Mu3, separate in our mind. We can think of them as separate. We can treat them as if they're separate. So there's a whole there's a whole range of answers here, and if you really want to ask what is most separate, it's going to be something that's completely one. And that's why the unmoved mover is separate form. or separate ousia.
Good.
As far as us, on one hand, we're separate from each other. You'll be happy to know we're two individuals. But on the other hand, and we live in a world where we interact with lots of things, and we couldn't actually exist if we were separate from the other things in the world.
Good. I'm also inclined to interpret separability in terms of oneness. And so I just have one more follow-up, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
I'm then curious, as you pointed out, the aporiae in beta are discussed in terms of oneness, and then kappa and mu here talk about separate existence. I was wondering if you had a story. I mean, you kind of had a story about why you thought kappa might have been an earlier discussion, and then beta is a more refined discussion. But why talk about oneness and separability if they're the same thing, I guess?
Right. Okay. So good question. So that wasn't mine. I was just mentioning Jaeger, who
Okay.
treated it that way. I don't think that's right. Jaeger thinks that the metaphysics is just it's a mess. They're doublets, and that repeat the same. So and then some editor assembled it, and I'm making the opposite kind of case. I think that it's actually pretty coherent. So in book beta, the questions are raised as unity questions. All of book beta stems from the assumption that a principle must be one. And I could elaborate on how that assumption gives rise to almost every aporia in book beta. There's only one question about actuality and potentiality that doesn't fit the model here. And this is a problem because if you remember, book alpha begins by talking about other philosophers, pre-Socratic philosophers who address the problem of first principles in terms of the problem of the one and the many.
Mm-hmm.
And book beta is completely in that line. Now, in following this problem out, Aristotle eventually, in the central books, he solves the problem. He explains, at least he gives an answer. We may or may not be happy with his solution, but he explains how it is that the form is one and the cause of unity in the composite. And it's, as usual, whatever we're going to say about it, whether it works or not, it's really interesting. After the central books, the question becomes, is there another cause?
Oh, right.
And this other cause is going to have to be separate because the form is going to account for the essential nature of the sensible ousia. And if you think about it in terms of the posterior analytics, it's going to account for all of the essential attributes. Okay, great. Any other causes? If there are, they've got to be separate. And that's why after the central books, we get this problem about separate causes. So the aporiae in kappa, they're reformulated.
Mm.
Now they're problems not of unity, they're problems of separation. And they're treated in lambda, in mu, and in nu as problems of separation. Well, first of all, in kappa, there's a large portion that it repeats something that's in the physics, which most people read and say, well, obviously this is just a mess. Somebody threw together some notes someplace. But actually, it's because if you think about it, the physics is about what? Potentialities that come to be actualized. And that actualization of potential, qua potential, is the definition of motion. And in the physics, we have to have a first principle of motion, which is the prime mover at the end of the physics. In the metaphysics, what we need is a first principle of being, which is the unmoved mover. And again, I'm if I'm offending anybody by suggesting that all of this is coherent, because it's not usually treated as coherent. But it seems to me to fit together. And if it doesn't, I'm happy to hear from any of you about where I'm going wrong on this. So thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Taylor. Then I think Gonzalo, can you now make your question, please?
Hi, can you hear me now?
Now it's fine.
Okay, yeah, I had to enter from my cell phone. Thank you, Edward, for the talk, and Edgar for organizing this. I'm gonna try to keep it brief. I mean, I have two questions that are related. The main one is on the direction that it seemed to me that you assumed from the beginning, in the sense that, you know, we have the two classical papers are Ian Mueller's, and then we have Jonathan Lear's. And Ian Mueller has a similar view that you have about mathematical, or like geometrical objects being inside in potentia. So you have, you know, some kind of body, and then inside of that you have everything you can find. On the other hand, Jonathan Lear has this view that he actually thinks that mathematical objects don't exist potentially, but they exist in actuality. I mean, he bites the bullet, and he does think that he brings the passage from the Anima, book 1, in which Aristotle says, you know, the line will touch the bronze sphere at a point. And that is a mathematical property that usually people think that physical objects do not have, but there it seems that Aristotle is just endorsing that view, that actually physical objects perfectly instantiate or exhibit mathematical properties. So one of my questions has to do with that. I mean, why? I mean, that seems to be a very strong direction and assumption to take. And I was wondering if there are some reasons why you think someone should go with the Ian Mueller way rather than the Jonathan Lear way. And the second one is connected to this, because when you were bringing the example from U2, you were saying that when you have a cube, then the surfaces that it has, the 6 squares, exist potentially. And that just, I mean, Aristotle doesn't say that himself explicitly in the text. I mean, it just struck me as very counterintuitive, because if I have a brick, especially if I am taking Aristotle's account, I will think that at least the surfaces that I'm touching in the brick made of, you know, a cubic brick are actually real, or they have certain actuality to them. It might be a different question whether those surfaces are actually squares and how perfect they might be, but the fact that I can hit upon them or think of them as real, and also maybe the lines that make those planes. Yeah, I just found it very, I mean, because there is no strong indication that Aristotle will deny that at least those surfaces do exist in actuality. So those are the two connected questions.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So this is something that Lear says that I find just frankly just baffling. You know, it's like everybody, almost everybody says there's the sphere or the brick is not a sphere, is not the sensible sphere is not a perfect sphere. The brick isn't a perfect solid cube, and it seems to me that that this is kind of obvious, and it just yeah, we get things that look pretty spherical, but that's not what we do mathematics on. Mathematics is not about, you know, going out and measuring a sphere. Mathematician has a definition of an object, and the object has perfect qualities that you just don't find in nature, however close you get. And I think this is a problem. It's a problem for both Mueller and Lear. How is it that you can have a mathematics that deals with perfect mathematical objects if the mathematics is about sensible things? And I just both Lear especially spends a lot of time trying to talk about, well, we get a sphere that's just, why not? Why shouldn't it do to be a perfect sphere? Well, think about just think about it. If we had a microscope and we looked at it at a surface under the microscope, we'd see there's a bunch of, it's not a perfect plane. It's not perfectly smooth. It's got a bunch of pock marks. And no matter how far we could get down, we would see that. And the Greeks have the same. They don't have the microscopes, but they have this idea that the sensible objects are losing bits of matter and they're gaining bits of matter, and actually that's pretty plausible because it's still the way we think about things. So the whole idea is kind of it's an effort that I can't see the purpose of. And the reason I can't see the purpose of is because I don't have to say that this brick has a flat surface in order for me to treat the cube as existing in sensible things, or not the cube, but the solid rectangular figure. I don't need it to be perfect, because whenever I have a bit of matter, all I have to do is divide that matter, and I can find within it, making the divisions, that perfect object. Like Aristotle says, Hermes is there in the stone. Guess what? It's not just Hermes, it's also the perfect sphere. And I don't need a sensible sphere to be a perfect sphere in its boundary to treat mathematicals as existing in sensibles. So it seems to me that the assumption that both Mueller and Lear are making, the assumption that if mathematicals are going to exist in sensibles, as Aristotle clearly says they do, then we have to have perfect mathematical surfaces of objects. It's just wrong. We don't need the surfaces to be perfect. What we need is to be able to divide them to find the perfect sphere within them, just as we can find Hermes within the stone. And as to the other part of your question, let's see, surfaces exist. He doesn't say surfaces exist potentially. Well, actually, he gets pretty close to that, and it comes up when he talks about Zeno's paradoxes. Zeno says, right, you can't make a single step, because every time before you get to across the room, you have to go halfway. Before you get there, you have to go halfway. Before you get there halfway, you can't take a single step, because there are an infinite number of steps that you'd have to take before you traverse a distance. And Aristotle says, look, this is just completely backwards. It assumes that the line is constituted from pre-existing points, but it's the other way around. The points are divisions of the line. And by the same reasoning, the line is a division of the plane, and the plane is a division of the solid. Are there pre-existing planes? Yeah, well, whenever we have a surface, a surface of a physical object, it's bounded in some way. Is it bounded by a plane? Yeah, maybe sometimes, pretty close. Is that the mathematical plane? Nope. And there's no reason to say that it is. Because we can take the solid and divide it, and the division is the mathematical plane, just as we divide a line and we find a point. It's exactly the same sort of reasoning. So he doesn't quite say, you're right, he doesn't quite say what I'm ascribing to him, but he does say it about points and lines. So I think there's just no reason to do what Lear does. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I mean, I am in the same field, the problem is that I think for philosophical reasons, it makes sense, everything that you say. I mean, it seems to be the most useful and common sensible view. The question is whether Aristotle is an outlier, because the same problems that you have with the imperfection of the physical world is what makes Plato and the Platonists posit actually mathematical objects for the same reason.
That's right.
Yeah, I agree that if possible, this is an account that seems much more stronger and commonsensical than the one that Lear has. So thank you for this. Thank you.
Yeah, and again, it's the points and the lines that are the basis of the account here, and I just extend it to surfaces as well as it's pretty clear that Aristotle is doing that or would do that in any case. So thank you for the question.
Thanks a lot, Gonzalo. And I think we're getting close to the end of the talk, but I think there are some more questions. So maybe we can perhaps take a little bit of your time and your patience and go on with the questions after 2 p.m. here. And if you are fine with this, Edward.
I'm fine. Look, I could talk about this all day and all night, so I'm happy. Okay. I'm happy to keep going here.
Okay, so let's try to keep it brief then. I have a few questions, Edward. One has to do with what Gonzalo was asking now. And I think, this mostly like a comment, because I think I agree with what you said, because I think that Aristotle, he accepts, the datum to be explained, right? He goes on with the Platonists and says, there is a sensible square there. There is a brick with the square sides. And so what we have to explain philosophy of mathematics is what makes this sensible thing square. And so, but he criticizes the Platonist proposal that this is explained by a separate object, by a separate non-sensible object. And but he still has to say what explains that sensible fact. And what so his mathematical objects will have to do that explaining and cannot be identical to the sensible things. So that's, I think, what he agrees with Plato, and that's why he says, well, if there are not substances that are in things or separate from things, they have to be in some other way. But he needs to posit something to explain the squareness of sensible squares. Otherwise, he's not doing what he thinks needs to be done, right? Because that was not wrong with the Platonists, I think. What do you say about that?
Right. Okay. So I was just explaining the mathematical square, how it's a portion of the plane that we recognize exists potentially within the plane, and the plane itself is a division of the solid, and we make and recognize the plane and the square by a kind of mental division. And your question, as I understand, is that okay? Maybe that will work for mathematics. But what about that sensible square? That's a square. What about that? And I don't have anything really surprising to say about that. I just think it's what Aristotle would say. Yeah, it's pretty close. It's got a lot of. It's pretty similar to a square. If we actually measured it, we'd probably find it's not perfect. In fact, we certainly find it's not perfect if our measurements were accurate enough. But on the other hand, yeah, you're gonna ask me about it. It's a square, and if I'm tiling my house, I'll talk about the square tiles. Fine, but that's not mathematics.
And don't you think there is some kind of doubling as well for Aristotle? Because you say, that's the physical thing, like the sensible property of squareness, which is not perfect. But then the solution seems to be, well, there's another kind of property there, which is potential in the thing, which is non-sensible. And that non-sensible immanent property is what explains the sensible property. It seems to be I mean, in some sense, seems to be like a kind of doubling, right?
Right. So I don't think it's a doubling, and I think it's not a doubling because it's you know, you take it, look at a ceramic tile, and you can make the measurements, and I bet if you had a ruler, you'd come out, they would be pretty close, and that's why you can use them to tile your floor because they're pretty close to squares. But are those the objects that we do mathematics with?
No.
I don't think so. I don't think we're not going to. Euclid is not going to use them for his proofs. That's all. We're going to talk about perfectly straight lines, and we're going to talk about perfect objects, and they exist in sensibles. So is it a doubling? No. It's like saying I have a square object that's close to being a square, and I can mentally divide that into a perfect square. So it's a part and a whole. And if you think about it, when you talk about a square, what are you talking about? You're talking about 4 sides and 4 right angles. So the square itself is constituted from other mathematical objects. And what do we, what do we say? We say what Aristotle says. Those sides and angles exist in the square potentially. They're part of the square, but they don't have their own independent existence unless we mentally separate them out. Now, is that a doubling? I don't think so. We can treat the square as a square, or we can treat the sides as line segments. That's up to us to do. What I think is more problematic, more interesting, is that within every solid object, you have all the mathematical objects. All the mathematical solids are there, and that raises a question. But wait a minute. How can they all be? Well, sure, we just focus on one or focus on another. It's up to us to mentally make the division, and we can see, we can understand, grasp, think them there. And if they're, the two, well, we can scale them down because the size never makes any difference in mathematics. So I hope I've answered your question.
I mean, yes, but just one small thing. But do you think that, I mean, if we have a brick, then the brick has both sensible lines and sensible points, or you would say that these are just mathematical objects?
Look, yeah. Okay. So the brick has a boundary, and the boundary is it has the characteristics of a plane. Is it a perfect plane? No. Look, I can imagine imagine taking the brick and dividing it into parts, and I can get perfect shapes that are exactly the same shape that I would like to ascribe to the brick, but they're perfect, and I would deal with them in mathematics. But you know what? I can also use my creative imagination and get messy shapes as well. I can get awkward, not rectangular solids. I can get sort of off rectangular solids, as if I were, making a painting of modern art, or trying to think of objects, how they could be, just mentally. I don't need to get perfect objects. I can get imperfect objects. Because I could divide that solid in any number of ways. And it's in the same way, the surface of the brick is, it's an imperfect plane.
Okay.
Not problematic, I don't think.
Okay, Edward, thanks a lot. And just one very small thing, and I will then move to another question.
That's what's incidentally, that's what Socrates always says before he has this decisive refutation. So
no.
I'm prepared here. Go ahead.
This is just, yes, you're right, but this is just really small thing. I mean, because, I mean, just according to your view of, I mean, your understanding of the structure of mu, you say that Aristotle wants to discuss both mathematical objects and forms, not just to refute the Platonists, but also to establish its ontological status, let's say, how, in the way in which they are. And I just wanted to question this. I mean, it seems to me attractive, of course, but the view you put forward. But I just wanted to question that on the basis of what he says in mu1, because there, as you remember, he says that he is going to discuss forms, but just haplos, right? I mean, and just like for the sake of costume or something like that. Because he has done that in several other places, right? And then when he says that at the end of the chapter, that they're going to inquire whether, he's going to inquire whether mathematical objects are substances that exist in things or separate from things, or if not, then he says that the investigation is about the way tropos, the way in which they are. But I think that as he says it in mu1, only seems to apply to mathematical objects. I mean, the investigation of ontological status, at least as he says that as he says it in mu1, only applies to the investigation of mathematical objects, right? He doesn't say in mu1 the same about forms, right? He says rather that he's going to talk about them in a very summarily way, and if there is investigation of ontological status, it seems to be restricted only to mathematical objects, and so that's, I wanted to know your view about I mean, how that affects your reading of the structure of the book.
Okay, good. Thank you. There are really two questions there, as I understand your comment. The first is when he says he's going to consider mathematicals by themselves and forms by themselves, does that mean that he's going to consider how they exist or not? And I think he spells it out. I can put this back on the screen if you want to, but I won't do it unless you want it. He spells it out that mathematicals by themselves are mathematicals that are not form mathematicals, and we're just going to treat mathematicals. And the forms by themselves, those are not the form numbers that some people have proposed, just the forms by themselves. And in fact, he does go on to talk about the form numbers in the course, because those are also forms by themselves in some way. So that's the first question. I don't think that it's to talk about mathematicals by themselves is antithetical to talking about the way in which the mathematicals exist. Now, take a look again at the passage at the end of mu1. He says, look, are mathematicals insensibles, or are they not insensibles? They're separate from sensibles. And if they're neither, then we're going to have to figure out how they exist. So this problem of the kind of ontological status of mathematical objects is being presented right at the beginning of the discussion at the end of chapter 1 of book mu. And he goes on and he gives an account in mu 3. What he doesn't do, as you were pointing out, he doesn't say the same thing about forms. Okay, true. However, and I said this in the talk, when we look at mu 4 and mu 5, he says, we have some reason to think that their forms are separate. Socrates didn't separate them, but he really, they need to be separate to be objects of knowledge. And on the other hand, we have some reason to think that they're not separate. Exactly the same aporia that we get, that he mentions at the book in mu1. What he doesn't do is he doesn't say, okay, now we have to figure out the way in which forms exist, except, and again, I quoted this passage at the end of chapter 9. He says, okay, you know, these forms, they're talking about them as separate substances, and they're universal and they're particular, and they can't be either way. It looks like he's doing exactly the same thing there that he proposed to do in mu1. Could he be clearer? Yes. That's often the case with Aristotle. But on the other hand, I don't think what you said would deter me from saying that he's treating the forms in exactly the same way as the mathematicals. He wants to find out their ontological status. And this is, I think this is really different from the way most people are reading this. They're just saying, he's dismissing the form. He's just, there are no Platonic forms. So that's, I think it's significant that really we find some place for the forms. They're universals. And universals have a reality to them. What kind of reality? There they are. They exist potentially in exactly parallel ways to the mathematicals.
Okay, thanks a lot. Then, Solomon, do you have a question?
Yes. You hear me?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your extremely illuminating lecture. You almost answered my question with the two previous ones, but not entirely, because my question is not about the work or the world of the mathematician. If a mathematical object or figure is insensible thing, how is it possible that some property of a mathematical object is false in all the sensible objects? For instance, take the sphere. Aristotle claims that the sphere is the only mathematical object that can move without any change of place. But this is possible only for the mathematical sphere, not for any sensible sphere with any imperfection. With this, excuse me. Aristotle explained against Archytas' paradox of the hand against a finite world. There is nothing outside of the universe, but then it is impossible for a non-mathematical sphere to rotate without changing place. And nevertheless, for Plato and probably for Aristotle, I think the sphere of the universe is rotating while it is not a mathematical sphere, and there is no space outside of the sphere of the universe. So how is it possible to understand this seemingly paradox? If it is one.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the question. Wow, you're sort of flipping things around in a way. You're making Aristotle be the one who's talking about the perfect mathematical sphere, and Plato somehow talking about an imperfect mathematical sphere. So I think that in Plato, the cosmos has it has the sphericity and spherical, and therefore we do the proportions. There's the sphere of the same and the sphere of the other, and the whole story, and they ought to be perfect, but as insofar as they exist in matter, they're probably not going to be perfect. And I could say a lot more about why they can't be perfect. I don't know, this is more like a paper. I need to talk about the Timaeus here. But I don't know, should I take the time and do it or not here? Okay, the Aristotelian sphere is, as I understand it, it's immaterial because it exists in a thing, but we're treating it as if it's something that's separate. So it's a pure quantity that has a matter, but we're not dealing with the matter. The Platonic sphere that you're talking about in the Timaeus exists in the cosmos. Now, if you ask the question here, what does the cosmos consist of? Well, of course, they're the works of reason. And then we go to the second part of the Timaeus, we get the works of necessity. And I don't know if I should say this or not here. I've already shocked everybody, so I'll just go ahead and say it here. The world in the second part of the Timaeus consists of triangles, right? How can you impose a spherical shape and a spherical motion on triangular matter? Can't do it. On the other hand, Plato also deals with mathematicals as separate. He thinks they really are separate, but not in just separate. They also exist in the cosmos. So I think I've answered your question. Yeah. So thank you for the question.
Thanks a lot, Solomon. So now we move to the last question. Joseph, please.
Hi, Ed. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, I can. Nice to see you, Joe.
Yes, thanks for a really daring and interesting and unifying paper. I missed the very beginning because of a computer connection failure, but toward the end, you said, if I got it right, the universal exists in the individual as a potential. Mm-hmm. And the mathematical exists in the individual as a potential. And that makes a lot of sense. I'm just wondering, though, how one deals with the notion of the form as providing, say, to an individual an essential identity. And similarly, then, in the case of a mathematical, at least with certain objects, say, for instance, like the human eye, circularity being instantiated, so to speak, is really important, so that you get a really neat iris and so forth. So you had mentioned in while you were talking about the possibility of seeing different mathematical shapes in objects, so that if you had a mountain of mud or something, you could see all kinds of things. And I take it that's true. But in the case of organic things, where somehow the identity of what the organ or animal is, somehow the mathematical would have to be actively exerting the notion of the mathematical, or the form that particular mathematical is, or the essence that it is, would have to be exerting a kind of force. So I'm wondering if you could say something about that in terms of providing identity.
Yeah. Thank you. Great question. So first of all, as I'll talk about the universal and the form. You said the form provides a kind of essential identity, and the universal can't do that. And I think that's a great reason to distinguish the form from the universal. And that's they're both eidos, so it's the same Greek word, but the form is an actuality, an energeia, and the universal is a dunamis. It's a potential, and that comes out at the end of in mu10, and that's a reason to distinguish them. So the form does provide an essential identity, but the universal doesn't. It's just a potential, and it's a difficult distinction to make, and a lot of people kind of stumble on it. But it seems to me that in the light of book mu, it's really necessary to make that, and also even in Zeta, because in Zeta he argues that the universal can't be an ousia and that the form is an ousia. So I don't think we have any choice but to say that if it's going to be coherent, that the form can't be the universal. And I'm not the only one who says this. Of course, lots of other people do. So, but your other question is about the mathematicals, the circular shape of the eyeball, for example, that seems to be really essential to the eyeballs being what it is. And this is where Aristotle's treatment of mathematicals gets, I think, really interesting And you may find it just just problematic. So there are different kinds of mathematicals. In general, the mathematicals that I've been talking about today belong to the categorical genus of quantity. There are other mathematicals that belong to the categorical genus of relation. And these are the mathematicals that we count with. This is in book new, which I didn't talk about. I have a bunch of, I've got a bunch of sheep. I count, the sheep, and I have a 1, and I figure out how many sheep there are in my herd, or whatever it is that there is of sheep. I've already exhausted my knowledge of agriculture. But if it's the case, as Aristotle says in the categories, that a quantity and all of the other categories belong to ousia, and he means individual ousia, then the number of sheep can't be a quantity because it doesn't belong to an individual ousia. But it can be a relation, and each sheep that I count is one of a number of them that are all related. So there are numbers that are quantitative numbers, those subjects of mathematics. There are relational numbers, which we use in counting things. And then there's the numbers that you talk about, or the mathematicals that you talk about, which are the mathematicals that belong to the essential natures of things. These are mathematical objects that belong in the category of ousia. And he distinguishes them. This is also in book new. It's the end of new, new 6. There are some mathematicals that are just, they're just analogies. They don't really have any significance at all. They don't really have much of being at all. And then there are other mathematicals that are just really parts of the essential nature of things. And you put your finger on one of them, the shape of the eyeball. It comes up, the subject comes up in the posterior analytics, where he talks about, he makes a distinction between the circular that's described by the mathematician, but also there's the circular that the doctor has to know about, because it turns out that circular wounds heal the fastest because they're, or the slowest, I don't remember which one of them anyway, getting late. But anyway, that's a different kind of circularity. One of them is a mathematical property, and it's important to know the property that the circle has, but there it's the every place is the same distance from the center. It's important for the doctor to know that. But when the doctor deals with it, he's not dealing with it as a mathematical object. He's dealing with it as part of medicine. And the eyeball too has to be circular in order to perform the function that it does. And that's something that would be very important for a doctor or physiologist to know about. So this is where, it seems to me, this is where things really get problematic for Aristotle. It's one thing to say, there are other places too, I didn't get a chance to go into them, but it's one thing to say that mathematical objects exist in the sensible things. And it's another thing to say, if that's the case, there are going to be a bunch of different kinds of mathematical objects, and they are not all treated by mathematics. It's very, very interesting, but also very problematic. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. That really helps. So.
Well, thanks a lot for your question, Joe. Then I think we have to finish now. There are no more questions, and I just thank Edward for this great talk, and everyone for the great discussion and for staying until this late time. And so, thanks, Edward.
Thank you, Edgar, for organizing this, and I've obviously had a ball here. It's great, and thank you for inviting me, and wish everybody well.
Okay.
you.
So thanks to everyone, and you can watch the session again in our YouTube channel. Just look for SIFAR YouTube, and then you will find it. And if not, I will send you the link.
Send me a link to it, please.
Yes, I will send the link to everyone who
Very good
today, and so people can watch it later.
And I'm happy to hear other questions that may arise later on when you think through this more here. But thank you very much for your comments and discussion.
Thank you, Edward.